Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking that like children like really don't want to do a workbook. It's what you do at like schools. And that's kids even more don't want to work against OCD because it's extremely uncomfortable, whatever you're doing to go to combat OCD. So I thought that like what do kids love to do? They love to listen to stories and they like to like look up to people and they want to be certain people in the stories they read. So I thought it would be great to write an actual story that kids could like enjoy reading with their parents and that they could also learn how to defeat OCD.
Welcome to OCD Whisperer podcast. Today with me, I have Ella Kim. She's a high school student who lives in New York City. She's interested in studying psychology and treatment of mental and behavioral disorders. Her brother was diagnosed with OCD at a young age, which has made her interest in these topics. She decided to write How to Defeat Bully Brain in order to help young children and their families combat OCD. Welcome to the show, Ella.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So you and I were just chatting a moment ago before we started here. We actually met at the International OCD Conference. And anybody, who's watching this right now on YouTube, you're going to see me flash the book that I picked up from Ella. So this is it. And I thought this is cool. And I just have not had somebody, who's younger on the show and kind of talk about your own perspective. But let's kind of dive into how did you come up with this idea to write this book?
Well, as you know, and as you mentioned in my bio, my brother was diagnosed with OCD from a young age. I want to say about 6 or 8. And so, I mean, we've always kind of grown up like with a person with OCD in our family. And it's been a bit of a struggle because there's a lot of trying to figure out like the family dynamics and also like how much you're supposed to kind of like help them and how much you're supposed to like leave them alone and what you're supposed to do in certain case scenarios. And I kind of wanted to help in my own way. So I went into this deep dive and I kind of looked at OCD resources out there. And I found that there weren't that many children's books that weren't like workbooks that kind of went into how to deal with your OCD. And so I kind of wanted to create it and put it out there in the world.
I think it's awesome. And I think you have such a great, unique experience too, because we often hear too in the OCD kind of niche, right? Like you hear people who have OCD, but I don't often as often hear about the family members that are dealing with this, especially siblings. So would you mind telling us a little bit about kind of your own story and experience?
Yeah, well, I'd say it's like interesting. I mean, sometimes I will say, as a sibling or as a family member in general, you can have moments where you're really frustrated because, like, in reality, there's not that much you can do because you also don't know what the person is actually thinking, and you can't really exactly share the same experiences since it's so different. And so there's like that frustration, but there's also that like feeling where it's like you kind of like have to let go of your frustration and like allow you to like kind of empathize with the other person, and you have to be able to like not like overload them and like not make their life super easy by like getting rid of all the things that make them uncomfortable, but like letting them deal with that themselves and kind of just like watching them work through it themselves without interfering.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I definitely have heard that from many families and loved ones where there's some frustration. And then also this process of, like you said, like balancing, right? Like,
Mhm.
how much do I help you? How do I help you? When do I back up? So how did you all navigate? Did you guys as a family see a specialist? Did you all kind of read things on your own and kind of do it from books?
Yeah, well, at the beginning, he had some workbooks that he worked through, but then he also had a therapist. And like sometimes, like at the beginning, we would all go with him to the therapy sessions. And then like I'd be sitting in the room and my parents would be talking to the therapist. And it was kind of like that. But then like as he got older, he would kind of just go to these therapy sessions regularly, like weekly or twice a week, depending. And yeah, that's kind of how we navigated it. We also just got like used to knowing what to do because after a while, like, and also like from help from like books and websites and like what the therapist tells you to do as a family, you kind of just like get the gist. And from then on, it's like experience.
Yeah. So can we talk a little bit about the experience part? Because yeah, I'm sure people can read stuff online, but it's so different kind of reading a guideline or something versus when you're actually in the home together in it as it's happening?
Mhm. Well, okay, there's been like a few incidents where I'd say it's like there's times when your OCD is worse and when it's better. And so sometimes when his OCD would be worse, it would kind of impact the entire family. So, for example, he was big on the washing, and sometimes it got to the point where it would be like the things surrounding him. So, like rooms, and like he would hang out in the basement a lot. So, one time we like it wasn't like we were coming home, but it was like we went down to the basement to get something, and, like, the entire floor was, like, stained with these watermarks. Yeah, and so that was a big shock, and it was like they've been there for a while, no one really noticed it because no one went down there, and he was, like, constantly wiping everything around him and the floors, and so everyone, like, kinda got, I'd say, like, frustrated was, like, the initial reaction because, first of all, like, the mess and also just, like, knowing how bad it got, like, to be wiping, like, entire floors of areas. But then, I mean, again, you kind of have to, like, look past that and kind of regroup together and realize that, like, he just needs more help rather than, like, you yelling at him, getting mad for him, like,
Yeah.
wiping the entire.
So how do you then as a family or even as just as you, I mean, obviously for your own experience as a sister, I mean, you're witnessing this, but what would you say for you was a thing of how you found that way or that balance, I guess, of how to be there for your brother, how to support him and like what does that really mean, right? Because like you said, the whole thing is trying to understand an experience that you can't
Mhm.
quite relate to all the way because it's so different, but you're learning about it so that you can, have some education. But what did that look like? Like, when the reassurance maybe was needed, or can you kind of accommodate and just help out in this way?
Yeah, so I'd say to never, like, accommodate them by, say, they really wanna wash their hands or something, never, like, just let them do that. I'd say remind them constantly to, like, say no to OCD and, like, give them reasons why. So, like, why are you trying to get rid of OCD? You're trying to get rid of OCD so you can go back to, like, not having to spend hours in a day washing your hands or like, not feeling uncomfortable for over half the day. And so I feel like it's always that, like, kind of future outlook that's, like, your way of comforting someone, and that's, like, the way people with OCD, I feel like, kind of have the ability to get through it.
That's cool. And so with this book that you wrote, How to Defeat Bully Brain, a story about OCD. Yeah, what was that like to sit down and kind of put this together in a story format?
I'd say it was really fun. The story changed a lot throughout. It took me, I wanna say, about half a year to write it
Mm.
because it's my first one, and so it was, like, fun to write. I originally just started kind of drafting random, like, pages, and it was very rough at the beginning, and then I had other people in my family read it. They gave me advice on it, and I kinda went constantly back to the drawing board to make it more of a story that was very fluid instead of, like, rigid instructions that workbooks will usually give you.
Yeah,
And
and so
yeah.
you did mention that, the thing you didn't see is you didn't see a book that's a story. You saw more workbooks.
Mhm.
So can you tell us a little more about that? Like what was that shift that you felt like or what was the thing that was missing that you wanted to kind of sounds like kind of step in and plug that hole with this book?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking that, like, children, like, really don't wanna do a workbook. It's what you do at, like, schools, and kids even more don't wanna work against OCD because it's extremely uncomfortable, whatever you're doing to go to combat OCD. So, I thought that, like, what do kids love to do? They love to listen to stories, and they like to, like, look up to people, and they wanna be certain people in the stories they read. So, I thought it would be great to write an actual story that kids could like, enjoy reading with their parents and that they could also learn how to defeat OCD.
Yeah, I read through the book and I have to say, like, I definitely enjoyed how it was cool to see how like the family kind of came around the main character, right? And was like, okay, like let's see, we have a plan, let's try this. And together let's kind of cheer you on and support you by breaking this big problem down into smaller steps. Now, is that something that you guys all learned from exposure response prevention therapy?
Yes. So I like to call it the staircase method, and basically, you can draw a little staircase. This is what my brother did when he was younger too. And basically, each step is a small step towards defeating OCD or your bully brain, how I phrase it in this book. And so it's small steps, so you won't be too uncomfortable every step, but like gradually you'll get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that it's also like when you make it visual, right? To your point, especially younger kids or kids in general, having something you can draw on, you could see, you could even, I don't know, you can use stickers or markers to kind of like, okay, we did that. Next step. I think that's just a really great approach to doing this.
I thought it was like a great approach also because it doesn't seem as like daunting when it's small steps. It's like also like thinking about a regular staircase. Like you can't jump from the first floor to the second floor, but you can climb a staircase easily to the first floor to the second floor. And so I kind of liked that metaphor. So I included it in the book.
Yeah, I loved it. So what's your hope with the book? Tell us like what's your hope or what's your goal? What would you like to achieve with this?
So I'm actually working on starting a nonprofit called OCD Detectives centered around the book. And basically the goal is to bring the books and bring them to a bunch of like elementary schools and do a bunch of readings to kind of spread awareness about OCD, about what OCD is, and teach kids who have OCD like how to combat it. And so I feel like that's the main goal, to spread awareness and to spread like what to do when you have OCD.
First of all, I think that's brilliant. I love it. Question for you is if you're talking to also younger kids, what would you say from kind of just your experience witnessing this? What are some signs or some things that you could tell the younger population of what kind of things to look out for if maybe they're not aware of what they're thinking or doing is OCD?
Yeah, I think that can be really difficult because there's a lot of different obsessions and compulsions. And so I'm actually writing a second book that covers that. And so basically in the second book, it's more of a graphic novel style. And it's basically going through and teaching kids the different types of obsessions and compulsions because there's so many that it's almost like impossible to know, like for a random person, it's like know the random ones, because most people just know like, oh, I'm obsessed with organizing things. I'm obsessed with washing my hands. When in reality, there's like 100 different obsessions and compulsions. So I want to try to cover that. And that's what I'm going to do in the second one.
I love it. I love that you have a second book. Is there any that you would, well, what was, you said your brother was dealing with, some washing and cleaning things. Is there
Mhm.
anything else that you've learned along the way that, because, from just the work I do, including this podcast, for example, by teaching people that, hey, it's not always going to be physically visible. You might see some things, and usually it's repetitive things you'll see over and
Mhm.
over that start to catch your attention. Sounds like, washing up the floors you were mentioning in the basement. It could be things like constantly asking similar questions to get that reassurance that is everything okay? Will it be okay? Or will you be okay? Or but somehow finding a way where you start to realize, wait a minute, we've covered this topic and yet here we go again. But there's also a lot of mental rituals people can do with OCD, where they can quietly, say certain numbers or trace
Mhm.
things with their eyes or pray a certain way, or some people do math or thinking thoughts a specific way. Then, of course, there's things like tapping, touching, symmetry is one, but yeah.
Yeah, so as you know, throughout a person's life changes like at least 10 times. So at the beginning, what I know is that when he was about 6 or 8 years old, it was the questions. It was like, oh, did I close that? Did I close that? Did I close that? Or like, do you like me? Do you like me? Do you like me? It was constant questions. And then I think it kind of turned more into the washing. And then it turned more into like the not being, this is like a very niche one, I feel like, not being able to lie,
Mm.
like having a worry about even like white lies, like, oh, I'm sick, I can't go to swim. Like that was impossible. So that's what it turned into. And then it kind of went back to hand washing and contamination and like touching things that were dirty and then immediately washing his hands and arms. And then that got worse and turned into like the contamination of rooms and things like that. And I feel like that's kind of the main arc of how his OCD went.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point that it can and it does move in terms of some of the topics. What would you say from your point of view and everything you've learned, if you were going to kind of educate people in this moment about like what is OCD, how would you define it?
I would define it as, I would say, reoccurring obsessions and compulsions or like actions. So, like repetitive thoughts and repetitive actions. That's what I would define it as.
So if
Because
somebody's
there's
looking
always,
out for this, they
Mhm.
would be looking for something like, okay, if I keep having certain kind of things pop in my head, or I find myself like feeling the need to do something over and over and over and can't quite move on.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's what I'm pretty sure. Like, there are, like, to be officially diagnosed with OCD, there is an amount of time you need to spend on these obsessions and compulsions per day. I mean, they say it's about like an hour. Yes, you would start having to worry more about your OCD if it was taking up an hour of your time a day. But I'd also say it's important, even if it's like 30 minutes of your day, to make sure that you kind of combat it and keep it under wraps, because it is this thing that gets stronger and stronger as you leave it alone.
Yeah, exactly. And I think exactly that's a great point, is that even if it seems like it's not as taking as much time, but it's still taking time, that yeah, you want to be kind of aware of that and working on it, because it's one of those things that can very quickly suddenly turn, and next thing you know, you're suddenly in a really bad place, and then it's really hard to kind of have to go through the whole process again to break out of it, which you can. That's the beautiful thing about it, is that you can, and you can get back to living a full healthy life. At this point, would you say, are you guys all kind of in, where are you guys at with this whole process as a family? Are you in recovery? Is there still a lot of struggle?
Basically, at the end of high school, I'd say it was pretty bad, and then he went on a gap year. So, 1 year between high school and college. And so during this gap year, he went to like a program abroad, and I'd say got much better over his program abroad. Even though he wasn't even doing any active therapy, I think just being away and being like preoccupied with other things, he was doing a lot of volunteer work, helped him some way. I don't know, but when he came back, he was much better. And I'd say, I mean, it's still present, but it's way better than it was before.
Wonderful. Well, and it sounds like you, as a family, everybody has some tools and better understanding. And like you said in the very beginning, right? The ability to kind of sort through, where do we help, how much, and where do we kind of have to step back a bit more.
Mhm.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. So, if folks want to find you, how can they find you?
Well, I have a website for my book. It's called defeatbullybrain.com, and it has a link to my book on Amazon, and it also has my socials. One of my For the nonprofit, I also have an Instagram account called OCD Detectives.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.